Racist woman thought tossing Big Shaq's phone into the river would erase a dream. But rivers remember. What unfolded next at Willow Creek shattered silence, unearthed buried truths, and turned a small town's darkest secrets into a reckoning no one could outrun. Big Shaq didn't need fists to fight, only the unstoppable power of truth. This wasn't just about a stolen phone. It was about breaking chains that had held a town captive for generations. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung lazily over the town of Willow Creek, its warm fingers stretching across the rippling surface of the river. It was the kind of day that made you believe, even if only for a moment, that everything could be good and right in the world. The riverside bustled with life, balloons bobbing against the breeze, children laughing, barbecue smoke curling into the blue. The community had turned out in full, an annual charity event designed to raise funds for the town's underprivileged youth. And at the heart of it all stood Shaquille O'Neal, known to the world as Big Shaq, but known to the people gathered there as simply Shaq, the man who had come not as a celebrity, but as a neighbor, a friend. Shaq's laugh boomed over the clatter of voices, his giant hands deftly flipping burgers on the grill, while trading jokes with the kids lined up for a taste. He moved through the crowd like a living monument, smiling, bending down to listen to every story, signing autographs with a humility that made it seem like he was the one honored by their presence. His heart was stitched into this day, sewn into the river's reflections, and the hopeful eyes of every child who tugged at his sleeves. But not every gaze was filled with warmth. Across the way, half hidden behind a booth selling homemade crafts, a woman stood rigid, her arms folded tight across her chest. Her eyes, a hard, steely gray, locked onto Shaq with a coldness that cut through the summer heat. She was out of place in a sea of smiles and easy laughter. Her lips were pressed into a bitter line, her skin pale against the bright colors of the fair, her posture a silent protest against the joy unfolding before her. Few noticed her, fewer cared, but Shaq felt it, the weight of her glare, the unease prickling the back of his neck. He brushed it off at first. It wasn't the first time he had been stared at like that. It wouldn't be the last. He turned back to the kids, ruffling hair, handing out plates piled high, letting their laughter drown out the quieter, uglier undercurrents that sometimes accompanied his every step. The day rolled on, golden and sprawling, and Shaq's spirit refused to dim. He moved to the edge of the river, where a stage had been set up for the closing ceremony. The mayor, a small wiry man, with a perpetual squint, handed Shaq a microphone and clapped him on the back. The plan was simple, a speech about hope, a donation reveal, and a surprise announcement about a new youth center funded almost entirely by Shaq himself. It was supposed to be a moment of triumph, the culmination of months of hard work and quiet generosity. Shaq pulled his phone from his pocket, ready to read a few heartfelt words he had jotted down that morning. The device gleamed in his massive hand, a simple tool cradling the dreams he had poured into this town. He cleared his throat, a rumble of anticipation passing through the crowd. That's when it happened. The woman, previously a silent specter in the background, surged forward. Her movements were sharp, almost mechanical, driven by a force that seemed to come from somewhere far deeper than the moment. No one had time to react. Not the mayor, not the children clustered at the front, not Shaq himself. In one swift, vicious motion, she lunged up the steps of the stage, her fingers clawing at Shaq's hand, and before a single coherent word could be spoken, she had ripped the phone from his grasp. For a split second, the world tilted, suspended in disbelief. And then, with a savage arc, she hurled Shaq's phone into the wide, yawning mouth of the river. It sailed like a blackbird, glinting once in the sun before plunging into the dark water, swallowed whole, without so much as a splash worth remembering. Gasps rippled through the crowd, horror slicing the festive air to ribbons. Shaq stood frozen, arm half extended, a man whose trust had been ripped away as easily as a page from a book. The woman didn't speak. She didn't scream or cry or offer any justification. She simply turned, her face locked in an expression of grim satisfaction, and stepped down from the stage. It was almost ritualistic, the way she disappeared into the throng, leaving behind only confusion, anger, and a silence that rang louder than any accusation. For a few endless beats, no one moved. The river flowed on, uncaring, its surface smooth and glassy as if mocking them all. The balloons, the laughter, the music, all of it seemed absurd now, grotesque against the backdrop of what had just unfolded. Shaq lowered his hand slowly, his face unreadable, the microphone hanging loosely from his fingers. Somewhere a child began to cry. It wasn't the phone that mattered. Not really. It was what it represented. His connection to the people he served. The dreams he had documented. The silent promises stored in its depths. Contacts, plans, letters from kids, recordings of future projects. All gone, consumed by the river without ceremony or mercy. Still, Shaq didn't move. He didn't shout. He didn't chase after her. He simply stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him like a millstone. He had seen racism before. He had lived it, fought it, risen above it. But there was something uniquely cruel about this act. Something that struck at the very heart of who he was. Not just a black man. Not just a celebrity. But a human being daring to believe he could belong. He could build. He could be trusted. The crowd began to murmur, low and uncertain. The mayor stumbled forward, his face pale and strained, whispering apologies that sounded hollow even as they left his lips. Volunteers shuffled awkwardly, unsure whether to comfort Shaq or simply pretend the day could somehow be salvaged. Shaq forced a smile, a slow, sad thing that didn't quite reach his eyes. He handed the microphone back to the mayor, clapped him once on the shoulder with a hand heavy as regret, and stepped down from the stage. His massive frame parted the crowd, like a ship cutting through fog, and no one dared meet his gaze. He walked toward the river's edge, his footsteps deliberate, his breath even. He stood there for a long time, staring at the place where his phone had vanished. The water lapped lazily at the shore, indifferent to the human drama unfolding beside it. Somewhere upriver, a heron took flight, its wings slicing the air with effortless grace. Shaq watched it go, a muscle ticking in his jaw. Some moments demand anger, some demand action. But this moment, bitter and aching, demanded something harder: patience, resilience, the kind of quiet strength that doesn't make headlines, but changes lives all the same. He could have called for the woman's arrest. He could have demanded justice on the spot. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't about a phone, or even about one woman's hatred. It was about something far older, far uglier, something that wouldn't be healed by throwing a punch or pressing charges. It would have to be healed another way. Shaq turned from the river, shoulders squared, eyes steady. The sun glared down, merciless and brilliant. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he walked back toward the children, the volunteers, the stunned faces waiting for a cue on how to react. He smiled again, this time a little stronger, a little fiercer. Without a word, he picked up the basketball resting near the grill and spun it once on his fingertip. A small girl, no older than 6, hesitated before breaking into a giggle and running toward him, her arms outstretched. The crowd began to breathe again. Slowly, uncertainly, like a town learning how to wake up after a bad dream. The day was not what it had been. It would never be that simple again. But it wasn't lost, not yet. As the river flowed behind him, indifferent and ancient, Big Shaq planted himself firmly in the present, ready for the battle that would follow. The battle not just for his name, but for the soul of Willow Creek itself. And somewhere, deep beneath the muddy water, a phone lay silent, carrying secrets that would not stay buried for long. Not if Shaq had anything to say about it. It hadn't started with the river. The unraveling had begun the moment Shaquille O'Neal rolled into Willow Creek weeks earlier. A quiet arrival cloaked in good intentions. He came without fanfare, driving himself in a battered blue pickup that looked ridiculous under his massive frame. No entourage, no flashing lights. Just a man carrying dreams stitched with hope and stitched again with memory. The memory of places where people forgot how to believe in each other. Shaq chose Willow Creek for reasons he barely admitted even to himself. It was a town caught in a pocket of forgotten America, charming in photographs, brittle in reality. Wide porches sagged under the weight of years. Churches and diners stood side by side like weary sentinels, guarding a place where time tiptoed forward, cautious and unwilling. It was the kind of place he thought could be mended with a little kindness, a little faith. The kind of place where a man could put down roots without needing to be a headline. At first, the town seemed to welcome him. There were banners strung over Main Street, reading "Welcome Shaq" in sloppy, cheerful handwriting. The mayor himself, George Langley, had met him at the edge of town with a handshake that was firm but lingering, like he wasn't quite sure whether to smile or brace for something heavier. Shaq had laughed, easy and booming, and pretended not to notice. But noticing came naturally to him. It always had. The first cracks appeared in the handshakes, Too many of them were too quick, fingers barely brushing, or else they lingered too long as if checking for something invisible. At the coffee shop, eyes followed him with a fixed politeness that didn't quite reach their mouths. In the hardware store, the clerks smiled and said "sir" with a sugary thickness that turned bitter when they thought he wasn't listening. He caught the way conversations would stutter into silence when he entered a room, the way the waitress at the diner always found a reason to wipe a counter rather than take his order herself. It wasn't hatred, not the kind that screamed and spit. It was quieter, slipperier. It was suspicion wrapped in smiles, distance dressed up as decency. It was racism's more insidious cousin, prejudice so baked into daily life that even those who practiced it wouldn't call it by its name. Shaq bore it the way a man bears an old injury. With patience, with endurance, but not with blindness. Still, there were those who genuinely reached out. Elijah Boone, a wiry man in his 60s with skin like worn leather and a laugh that sounded like a motorboat, had become one of Shaq's first real friends. Elijah owned the local mechanic shop and took to Shaq immediately, telling anyone who would listen that the man's heart's twice as big as his shoe size, and that's saying something. Then there was Clarissa Dean, the town's librarian, whose sharp mind and sharper tongue made her a force even the mayor respected. She brought him books about the town's history, wrapped in brown paper with notes scribbled in the margin. But even among friends, there were lines that never quite erased. Shaq learned quickly where he was truly welcome, and where he was only tolerated. He learned which sidewalks carried whispers in their cracks, which diners brewed hostility into their morning coffee. He learned to nod, to smile, to let things slide off him like rainwater, even as the chill soaked into his bones. It was at a town council meeting that he first noticed her, the woman with the gray eyes and the closed-off face. Her name wasn't spoken easily, as if the townspeople had learned that invoking her brought consequences. He heard it once, muttered under Elijah's breath. Madeline Cross. Madeline had once been the town's pride, the homecoming queen with golden hair and an easy laugh, the kind of woman who wore charm like a crown. But time had not been kind, and bitterness had fermented where beauty once lived. She rarely spoke at meetings, preferring to sit stiffly in the back, her silence loud enough to drown out conversations. When she did speak, it was to ask tight, cutting questions about budgets and decisions, her voice always pitched just slightly too cold. That day, as Shaq outlined his plans for a youth center, an idea meant to breathe life into Willow Creek's sagging dreams, he caught her watching him, not with curiosity, not with concern, but with something sharper, something that tasted like old wounds and deeper betrayals. It wasn't just that she didn't trust him, it was that she couldn't stand that he was here at all. She said nothing, just stared, and Shaq filed her gaze away with all the others he had gathered, like storm clouds on the horizon. Days passed, but the tension didn't fade. It deepened. It grew teeth. At the grocery store, Shaq noticed the cashier who used to chat easily, now rang up his purchases in silence, her eyes fixed on the register. At the gas station, two teenagers snickered behind their hands when he walked by, one elbowing the other in a gesture heavy with ugly meaning. The smiles stayed pasted onto faces, but they cracked around the edges, revealing glimpses of the rot beneath. It wasn't everyone. It wasn't even most. But it was enough to sour the air. Shaq tried to drown the growing discomfort in work. He met with architects, drafted blueprints, sat for endless committee meetings. He held basketball clinics for the kids at the dusty outdoor court, teaching them to dream bigger than the town would sometimes allow. He let the weight of suspicion pile up quietly on his shoulders, bearing it without complaint because he knew what waited on the other side of silence: change, if he could endure long enough to see it. But the river saw everything. The river, winding like a silver snake through the heart of Willow Creek, had long been a witness to things the town preferred to forget. It had carried away secrets and shame, whispered stories to the trees lining its banks. It had watched as histories were written and rewritten, depending on who was doing the telling. Madeline Cross's history was tangled with that river, in ways most folks avoided discussing. There were rumors, of course, stories of a grandfather who had built fortunes on land stolen from others, of family names scrubbed clean with money and influence. It was said that the Cross family once owned half the town and ruled the other half through fear and favor. Time had eroded their empire, but the pride remained, brittle and poisonous. Shaq didn't know the full truth yet, but he knew enough to be wary. There were moments when he caught Madeline staring at him, not with simple resentment, but with something deeper, something almost religious in its fervor. She looked at him like he was a threat to something sacred, something she had sworn to protect even as the world moved on without her. Shaq had dealt with people like her before. People who wore the past like armor and wielded it like a weapon. He knew that change, to them, was not progress, but a personal affront. His very presence in Willow Creek was a reminder that their world was no longer unchallenged, that history was no longer a fortress but a crumbling relic. Still he stayed. Still he smiled. Still he worked. Because hope isn't built in comfort. It's built in resistance. In standing firm against the slow, grinding pressure that wants you to give up, give in, fade away. The day of the charity event had been meant as a turning point, a public declaration that Willow Creek could be better, that it could embrace its future without fear. Shaq had poured everything into it, money, time, heart. He had believed, foolishly perhaps, that smiles could be real, that handshakes could be honest, that rivers could carry more than just sorrow. But rivers remember, and so do people. As Shaq stood on the stage that day, clutching his phone, feeling the weight of the town's eyes on him, he didn't just see a woman stealing a device from his hand. He saw an entire history crashing into him, silent and swift as a flood. He saw the whispers behind the smiles, and he understood, with a clarity so sharp it almost hurt, that his fight for Willow Creek had only just begun. The phone was gone. The river had claimed it. But the truth it contained, the truth Shaq carried in every fiber of his being, was not so easily drowned. It would rise, just as he would. The river swallowed more than just a phone that afternoon. It swallowed certainty, it swallowed hope, and it began to feast, quietly and ruthlessly, on Shaq's place in Willow Creek. What floated back to the surface in the days that followed was not sympathy, not outrage, but a creeping, infectious doubt that spread through the town like smoke through dry timber. Shaq knew what that phone had carried. It wasn't just a list of contacts or a collection of messages. It held proof, video recordings, signed digital agreements, documents that would have unveiled truths few in Willow Creek wanted dragged into the sunlight. Not all of them were scandalous, but they were potent enough to threaten the delicate illusions many clung to. Records of unfair land deals, testimonies from workers underpaid and mistreated, plans that exposed systemic favoritism stretching back decades. Shaq had gathered it carefully, not to destroy but to push for the change he believed the town could achieve, if only it faced its reflection honestly. Now all of it was gone, swallowed by water that could not speak on his behalf. At first the town wore a mask of polite concern. Sheriff Dalton stopped by the library, where Shaq sat speaking softly to Clarissa Dean, and offered to dredge the river. His words were syrupy and slow, his badge catching the late afternoon light. Shaq thanked him, knowing full well that the offer was hollow. The river was deep and restless, a maze of mud and shifting debris. Retrieving anything from its heart was nearly impossible without a serious effort, an effort no one truly intended to make. Soon enough the story began to bend. In coffee shops and on back porches, the narrative shifted. Whispers suggested that Shaq had overreacted, that maybe the woman had been provoked, that perhaps Shaq's presence in Willow Creek, despite his money and his fame, was stirring trouble better left alone. It was subtle at first, the way these suspicions wrapped themselves around the town's conversations, like creeping vines. An offhand remark at the diner about how outsiders don't always understand our ways. A pointed comment at the hardware store about how some people think they can just come in and change everything. Shaq heard it, not always directly, but enough to feel the tightening of the noose around him. Microaggressions sharpened into something uglier. At the basketball court where he had once been mobbed by laughing children, the parents now watched from folding chairs, their faces tense, their arms crossed. When Shaq offered high fives after a game, more than one child hesitated, glancing uncertainly at their mother or father before accepting. At the grocery store, Shaq noticed cans and boxes priced higher for him than for the customers ahead of him. At the gas station, a smear of spit found its way across his windshield after he parked. No note, no witnesses. He told himself not to react. He had been here before, in different forms, in different places, but the cracks began to form anyway. Tiny fractures in the armor he had spent a lifetime building. Willow Creek wasn't attacking him openly. It was something worse. It was withdrawing itself from him, treating him like a storm they were hoping would pass if they simply ignored it hard enough. Madeline Cross, of course, remained silent. She didn't need to say a word. Her act of hatred had fertilized a garden of resentment already buried in the soil. Now it bloomed, grotesque and unmistakable, and the town tended it with careful hands, Clarissa remained a steady presence at first. She continued to meet with Shaq, helping him draft letters to the town council, researching historical property records he could use to bolster his proposals for fair zoning laws. But even she began to show signs of strain. Shaq caught it in the way she paused before greeting him, when others were watching, in the way she flinched, almost imperceptibly, when he brushed her hand accidentally passing papers. Fear, he realized, not of him, but of what standing too close to him might cost her. Elijah Boone remained fiercely loyal, his loyalty a stubborn flame in a town quickly growing cold. But Elijah was one man, and the storm gathering around Shaq was bigger than friendship, bigger than loyalty. It was history rising from the riverbed, history that had never truly died. The question began to gnaw at Shaq. Should he fight? Should he plant his feet deeper, push harder, force the town to face itself? Or should he walk away, preserving what dignity he still had before the tides finished pulling him under? He waited every night, lying awake in the cramped room he had rented above the old pharmacy. He thought of the kids who had hugged him without hesitation, the ones who still dreamed of something more than dusty fields and empty promises. He thought of the families who had quietly handed him envelopes containing letters, confessions, hopes they dared not speak aloud. He thought of the river, endless and uncaring, hiding the proof that might have made this battle winnable. There were moments, dark and lonely, when walking away seemed not like surrender but survival. But every time the thought took root, he remembered the look in Madeline Cross's eyes, the certainty, the triumph. She hadn't just wanted to steal his phone. She had wanted to erase him, to remind him that no matter how big he was, no matter how famous or beloved, he would always be an intruder here. And that was something Shaq couldn't abide. Still, the battle was changing. At the next town council meeting, Shaq stood to propose funding for the youth center, only to be met with a wall of bureaucratic obstruction. They needed more studies, they said, more community input. They raised concerns about resource allocation and long-term sustainability. Words that meant nothing, words that meant only delay. Shaq saw it for what it was, a slow suffocation, the hope that he would grow tired and give up. After the meeting, as he walked to his truck, he found a note tucked under the windshield wiper. No signature, no fingerprints, just 5 words scrawled in blocky letters. Go back where you belong. He crumpled it into his fist, feeling the paper rasp against his skin. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He sat behind the wheel for a long time, staring at the sunset bleeding across the sky, thinking about belonging and what it cost to claim it. The town didn't need to run him out with torches and pitchforks. They had learned subtler, more effective ways. At the river, where the phone had vanished, children still played. Dogs splashed in the shallows. Fishermen cast lines with lazy arcs. Life moved on, indifferent to the small silent war playing out on its banks. But Shaq knew that rivers remember, and deep beneath the current, the proof he had lost still slept, waiting. One evening, Elijah pulled up beside him outside the closed basketball court. His old truck rattled to a stop, and he leaned out the window, his face grim. "They're talking about you," he said, voice low, "saying you faked it, saying you staged the whole thing to make him look bad." Shaq didn't react. He didn't need to. He had expected this. Lies were easier to believe when the truth threatened too much comfort. "You gonna stay?" Elijah asked, not pressing, not pleading. Shaq stared out over the empty court, where the wind stirred dust devils among the painted lines. He thought about leaving, about driving away and letting Willow Creek rot in its own denial. But he thought more about the kids who would watch him go. About the ones who would learn, once again, that standing up wasn't worth the cost. He thought about rivers, about how sometimes the only way to cleanse a place was to stand in the water, even when it pulled at your legs, even when it threatened to carry you away. "I'm staying," Shaq said finally, voice steady as stone. Elijah nodded once and drove off into the dusk. The battle lines were drawn now. The whispers had grown teeth. The smiles had cracked wide enough to show what lurked underneath. But Shaq had faced worse than whispers. He had faced worse than cold shoulders and poisoned glances. He had faced a world that tried every day to tell him he was less than what he knew himself to be, and he had never let it win. Willow Creek thought it could drown him in silence. It thought it could erase him the way the river erased the phone from his hand. But rivers remember, and so would he. As the first stars began to pierce the twilight, Shaq stood alone by the riverbank, his reflection rippling in the dark water. He made no promises aloud. He carved no vows into the night. He simply stood, tall, unmoving, unyielding. Because sometimes the fiercest battles aren't fought with fists or fire. Sometimes they're fought by refusing to leave. The town elites orchestrated the shift masterfully. The local paper, once eager to splash Shaq's picture across the front page, now ran cautious articles questioning his motives. Editorials appeared with headlines like "Change, at what cost?" and "Celebrity charity or self-promotion." On the local radio station, anonymous callers fretted over the new energy Shaq had brought to the town, wondering aloud if perhaps the peaceful, slow way of life was better preserved without outsiders stirring the pot. Worst of all was the whisper campaign. It snaked through church picnics, PTA meetings, barbershop chairs. People said Shaq had a temper, that he was demanding, that his presence made others feel unsafe. There were no direct accusations, only insinuations, left like poisonous crumbs for others to follow. And follow they did. At the diner one morning, Shaq felt it hit full force. He walked in, the familiar jingle of the bell overhead, sounding unusually loud in the sudden hush. Faces he had come to know. Mrs. Tanner behind the counter, old Mr. Whitlock sipping his black coffee, the Murphy twins sharing a booth. Froze mid-motion. Conversation skidded to a halt. Shaq moved to his usual table, but found it already occupied, the waitress avoiding his eyes as she cleaned menus that didn't need cleaning. He stood there for a beat too long, the meaning crystallizing in the stiff set of their shoulders, the careful way they didn't quite meet his gaze. He wasn't welcome. Not really. Not anymore. Without a word he turned and left, the door slamming against its frame harder than he intended. It wasn't just distrust. It was isolation, carefully engineered and ruthlessly executed, a slow erasure of belonging. That night, sitting in his truck outside the closed youth center construction site, Shaq grappled with a knot of emotions so tangled he didn't know where anger ended and grief began. He thought of the faces that had smiled at him when the cameras were rolling, that now flinched away as if his very presence was a contagion. He thought of the children who watched the adults, learning lessons they wouldn't even realize they had been taught. In the rearview mirror, he saw movement, a figure limping toward him from the shadows, hunched but determined. Shaq sat up, every instinct sharpened, but he stayed where he was. The man who approached wore an old army jacket 2 sizes too big, and a hat pulled low over weathered eyes. His face was a roadmap of lines, each crease telling a story of years spent watching more than speaking. He knocked once on the window, the sound sharp against the thick hush of night. Shaq rolled the window down halfway. "Got a minute?" the man rasped, voice gravelly from disuse, or too many years of smoke. Shaq nodded once. The man looked around, making sure no one was watching, then leaned in closer. "You think this started with you?" he said, not a question but a quiet accusation. It didn't. Shaq stayed silent, letting the man speak at his own pace. "Madeline Cross," the old man said, and the name cracked the night air like a whip. "You stirred up ghosts she spent her whole life trying to bury." Shaq's fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The man chuckled dryly. "You think it's about you being black? You think it's about you wanting to help these kids? It's bigger. Older. Deeper." He pulled something from his jacket, a folded photograph yellowed with time, and shoved it through the crack in the window. Shaq unfolded it carefully. It was a black and white image of a group of men standing proud in front of a newly built house. Among them, a younger version of Madeline's family patriarch stood, one hand gripping a deed, the other gripping the shoulder of a man standing slightly apart, a black man, head bowed, face shadowed. "That man," the old-timer said, tapping the photograph with a gnarled finger, "built half this town." His hands laid the bricks. His sweat soaked the wood, and when he asked for fair pay they gave him nothing but boots on his backside. Shaq looked up, feeling the weight of history settling around him like chains. "Your youth center's planned right on top of what used to be his land," the man said. "Land they took, buried under paperwork and lies. Madeline's granddaddy made his fortune on that theft. Made sure no black man in this town ever forgot who really owned what." Shaq stared at the photograph, the pieces clicking together with a sickening finality. It wasn't just that Madeline hated him. It was that his very presence, his insistence on building something new, something better, threatened to dig up the bones she had spent her life pretending didn't exist. "You're not just an outsider," the old man said. "You're a reckoning." He straightened up, limping back into the darkness before Shaq could ask his name. Shaq sat there a long time after, the photograph burning a hole in his hand. The river had swallowed the physical proof he carried. But now he held something deeper, something harder to destroy. Truth. And truth, when buried long enough, becomes a ticking bomb. The realization didn't make things easier. If anything, it made the burden heavier. Because now Shaq wasn't just fighting for the youth center, or for acceptance. He was fighting the very foundations of Willow Creek's self-image. Foundations built on theft and silence. In the days that followed, the betrayals deepened. Clarissa stopped returning his calls altogether. Elijah, bless him, still showed up. But he came later now, left earlier, his words more cautious. The mayor's office stopped responding to his proposals, citing backlogs and technicalities. The river of suspicion had burst its banks, flooding every avenue Shaq had once thought safe. He wasn't just being resisted, he was being erased. Yet even as the walls closed in, Shaq felt a new clarity harden inside him. He could not play by their rules anymore. He could not wait for their permission, could not trust in their systems to protect him. He had to be louder, smarter, unbreakable. He wasn't just here to build a center for kids. He was here to break a curse. And some curses don't go quietly. The next town meeting would be critical. It would be a showdown, one where Shaq's strength would not be measured in how high he could jump or how many hands he could shake, but in how deeply he could make the town look at itself, and how bravely he could stand when it didn't like what it saw. As the days shortened and the nights grew colder, Shaq prepared not for battle, but for truth. And the truth, once unleashed, would not be silenced again. Not by whispers, not by closed doors, not even by a river. The river moved with a deceptive calmness, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple of a fish or the dip of a bird's wing. To anyone passing through Willow Creek, it seemed like a picture-perfect slice of small-town life. But to Shaq, the river had changed. It was no longer just a body of water winding lazily through town. It was a witness. It was a grave. The old man's warning burned in his mind. The photograph now locked away in a drawer he kept under his bed, a reminder of the truths too dangerous to parade around openly. It explained so much. The cold glares, the subtle slights, the invisible noose tightening around his reputation. Madeline Cross wasn't fighting him because of what he was building. She was fighting to preserve the mythology her family had built atop stolen soil and broken promises. Her actions weren't just personal, they were generational, an inheritance of hate disguised as pride. Every time Shaq walked by the river now, he thought of the countless stories it had swallowed, the lives drowned out by silence. It had become a graveyard of memory, and his phone, lost beneath its murky depths, was only the latest in a long line of buried truths. It mocked him with its smooth, glassy indifference, a reminder that the things most precious often disappeared without leaving a ripple behind. Temptation gnawed at him with growing hunger. The thought of leaving crept into his mind like smoke under a door. Why stay? Why fight for a town that clearly didn't want him? The river would keep its secrets whether he was here or not. Let them have their broken histories, their half-truths, their comfortable lies. He had other places he could go. Bigger battles, maybe even fairer ones. He didn't owe Willow Creek anything. But every time he packed a mental suitcase, he saw the faces of the children, their wide, unguarded smiles before the fear seeped into them. He saw Elijah's weathered hands, steady even as the world trembled around them. He remembered the letters slipped to him in secret, desperate hopes, inked on cheap paper. And then came the twist he never expected. It was late afternoon, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and dying leaves, when Shaq saw him, a boy no older than 10, standing near the riverbank, where the charity event had unraveled. The boy's name was Carter Reeves, a wiry kid with messy blonde hair and a stubborn glint in his eye. Shaq recognized him from the basketball clinics, one of the few who hadn't stopped showing up, even as the crowds dwindled. At first, Shaq thought Carter was skipping stones, but as he drew closer, he noticed the boy wasn't playing. He was digging, clumsily, desperately, with a stick too small for the task. His shoes were caked with mud up to the ankles, his jeans torn at the knee. Something about the scene made Shaq pause, the air around him sharpening into a thin, expectant silence. Carter glanced up, saw Shaq, and for a split second panic flashed across his face. He dropped the stick and took a step back. Shaq raised his hands, palms out in a gesture of peace, and stayed where he was. He didn't speak. He didn't want to scare the boy into running. After a long, tense moment, Carter bit his lip, glanced over his shoulder, as if making sure no one was watching, and then motioned Shaq closer. Shaq approached slowly, his boots sinking slightly into the soft riverbank. The boy knelt and pulled something from the mud. A thin, battered object wrapped carefully in a plastic bag that had been double-layered and knotted tight. It wasn't Shaq's phone. That was still lost to the river. But it was something. Carter wiped the mud off with the sleeve of his shirt and held it out with both hands, trembling slightly. Shaq took it, feeling the weight of it settle into his palms like a verdict. Inside the bag was a small, handheld camcorder, the kind used by hobbyists or nosy neighbors. It was scuffed and battered, but intact. And judging by the weight, the battery inside wasn't completely dead. Carter's voice, when it came, was little more than a whisper. "I saw what she did," he said. "I recorded it." Shaq swallowed hard, the magnitude of what he was holding sinking in. Proof. Not just words, not just accusations. Actual proof. A record not just of Madeline's violence, but of the crowd's reaction, of the way silence had swept over everything like a blanket smothering a fire. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Shaq asked quietly. The boy shifted from foot to foot, glancing back toward the road where the town stretched out beyond view. "My dad works for the mayor," he muttered. He said if I made trouble we'd have to move." Shaq closed his eyes briefly, feeling the boy's fear, the impossible choice pressed onto shoulders far too young to bear it. He crouched down until he was at Carter's level. "You didn't make trouble," he said. "You did the right thing." Carter nodded, though he didn't look convinced. Shaq tucked the camcorder carefully into his jacket, then rested a massive hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "I'll handle it," he promised. "You don't have to be scared." Carter gave him a wavering smile before darting back up the bank, disappearing into the growing twilight. Shaq stood alone, heart hammering against his ribs, the weight of the river at his back, and the future pressing hard against his chest. The camcorder changed everything. It wasn't just Shaq's word against the town's anymore. It wasn't whispers battling whispers. It was truth made visible. Undeniable. If he chose to use it, if he chose to make it public, it could tear down the careful lies that had been built over generations. But it would also paint a target on Carter's back, on Elijah's, on anyone who dared to stand with him. The river had kept its secrets for a long time. Shaq now held the means to empty it. He spent the night sitting in his truck, engine off, staring out at the darkness stitched with stars. He turned the camcorder over and over in his hands, feeling the crossroads pulling at him. Expose the truth, and risk burning down what little goodwill remained. Stay silent, and allow the rot to keep festering, hidden under a veneer of civility. Neither choice was easy. Neither choice was clean. But Shaq hadn't come to Willow Creek looking for easy or clean. He had come looking for change. And change, real change, always costs more than you think you can afford. The decision crystallized in him with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier shifting. He would fight, not with fists or fury, but with truth, with patience, with the kind of courage that outlasts storms and silences towns. The river might have swallowed proof once. It wouldn't do it again. As dawn stretched its pale fingers across the sky, Shaq tucked the camcorder deeper into his jacket and stepped out of the truck. His breath misted in the cold morning air. His boots crunched over gravel. Each step forward felt like a hammer blow against the foundation of everything the town thought it knew. He didn't know what would come next. He only knew he wouldn't run. Willow Creek had its secrets, but so did he. And sometimes, the most dangerous secret of all is simply refusing to stay silent. The town square of Willow Creek had never been so crowded, yet so silent. It was the kind of gathering where the air itself seemed to tremble with expectation, where every cough, every shuffled footstep echoed louder than any shout could have. Shaq stood at the edge of the courthouse steps, his massive frame casting a long, unmoving shadow across the cracked pavement. Across from him, Madeline Cross stood with a lawyer at her side, a thin, pale man whose smirk barely concealed his satisfaction at the day's spectacle. In a place built on whispered history and polished lies, truth had become a dangerous fire, and today it threatened to burn through the very heart of the town. Madeline had called the meeting herself, disguised as an emergency town council session. Rumors had festered all week, twisting into something grotesque by the time the crowd assembled. She wasn't content to whisper anymore. She was going to accuse Shaq openly, standing tall in the light of day, confident that the town's old loyalties would shield her from the consequences. Her voice when she finally spoke was steady, practiced, a survivor of generations of control. She knew how to wield words like scalpels. "I stand before you today," Madeline began, "not as someone seeking vengeance, but but as someone seeking safety. In recent weeks, many of us have felt uncomfortable, intimidated, even threatened. Her eyes flickered meaningfully toward Shaq, lingering just long enough for the implication to settle without her having to say the words out loud. The crowd murmured. Shaq caught sight of familiar faces turning away, pretending sudden interest in their shoes or the distant horizon. It stung worse than an open accusation would have. Big personalities, Madeline continued, sometimes come into small towns with big ideas, but with those ideas can come pressure, demands, behaviors that make good, honest people feel unsafe in their own community. The lawyer nodded along, his hands folded primly in front of him, a picture of silent approval. Shaq said nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't move. He let the accusations wash over him like cold rain, each word another stone thrown, each lie another attempt to weigh him down. Madeline's performance was surgical. She never directly claimed Shaq had threatened her, but she painted a portrait vivid enough that the image formed all the same, a towering outsider, towering over fragile tradition, pushing, demanding, disturbing the peace. Shaq saw the strategy. It was a masterclass in dog whistles and plausible deniability, designed to ignite fear without offering anything solid enough to fight back against. When she finished, the silence that followed was suffocating. Sheriff Dalton, standing off to the side, adjusted his belt awkwardly, but made no move to intervene. The mayor, usually quick to smooth ruffled feathers, kept his gaze fixed firmly on a crack in the pavement. It was Shaq's reputation on trial, but no one in power intended to defend him. They intended to let him drown in innuendo, to let his name rot in the open air, without ever getting their own hands dirty. Shaq knew he had a choice.
He could rage. He could shout the truth, throw accusations of his own, rip apart the carefully woven lies, and force the town to confront its own ugliness. But that was what they wanted. They wanted the spectacle, the confirmation that their worst fears were justified, that the outsider was dangerous, unpredictable, unworthy of their trust. Instead, Shaq chose grace. Slowly he stepped forward, every movement deliberate, controlled. The crowd stiffened, some shifting back instinctively, already caught in the web. Madeline had spun. Shaq looked out over the gathered faces. He didn't reach for the microphone, waiting on the podium. He didn't need it. His voice, when it came, was low and steady, carrying across the square with a quiet power that demanded attention without raising itself once. I came to Willow Creek because I believed in it, he said. I believed in its children, its future. I believed that sometimes, if you pour enough love into a place, you can heal it. I still believe that. No theatrics, no anger, just the bare truth, laid down like a foundation stone. I never asked for anything, he continued. I never demanded. I never threatened. I came with open hands. And if open hands are seen as a threat, maybe it's not the hands that need to change. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Uncertain, uncomfortable. Shaq didn't blink. I will not apologize for existing, he said. I will not apologize for trying to help, and I will not be intimidated into silence. He stepped back, giving them no further ammunition, no unraveling to point to, just a mountain standing unbroken against the storm. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. And then, through the tense hush, a small voice piped up. I saw it. Every head in the square turned sharply toward the source. Carter Reeves stood near the edge of the crowd, his hands trembling but his chin lifted high. His father, standing next to him, hissed something urgent under his breath, but Carter shook him off. I saw her take his phone, Carter said louder, voice cracking but gaining strength. I saw her throw it. He didn't do anything wrong. The tension shattered like glass hitting pavement. 100 conversations broke out at once, confused, angry, incredulous. Madeline's face tightened, the cracks in her polished facade showing for the first time. Shaq's heart pounded against his ribs, but he kept his face neutral, his body still. He wanted to rush forward, to shield the boy from the storm he had just unleashed, but he knew Carter needed to stand on his own for this moment to matter. The lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously to Madeline. She shook her head sharply, her lips a thin, bloodless line. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, trying to restore order, but the tide had turned. The crowd's attention had shifted. Seeds of doubt, once planted carefully by Madeline, were now sprouting in the opposite direction. Clarissa Dean appeared near Carter, laying a firm hand on his shoulder, anchoring him. Beside her, Elijah Boone crossed his arms and lifted his chin,
daring anyone to challenge the boy's courage. The mayor finally found his voice, stammering something about needing to investigate further and review all the facts. Shaq knew what he was seeing. The beginning of the unraveling. Not a full reversal yet, not a tidal wave of support, but cracks forming in the wall that had been built against him. The river of hate that had flowed so freely was being dammed by the simplest, oldest power of all. Truth spoken out loud. Madeline tried one last move. She stepped forward, lifting a trembling hand to her chest, her voice quivering with carefully manufactured emotion. "We all make mistakes," she said. "But we must ask ourselves, who do we trust to guide us?" It was a desperate appeal, one rooted not in facts but in fear. Shaq didn't respond. He didn't need to. The truth hung in the air now, undeniable and heavy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the crowd began to shift. A few people turned away from Madeline. A few more drifted toward Carter, to Clarissa, to Elijah. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a beginning. As the meeting dissolved into tense conversations and furtive glances, Shaq walked back to his truck, feeling the strain of the day settle into his bones. Carter caught up to him, breathing hard. "I was scared," the boy admitted, staring at the ground. Shaq crouched down, looking him in the eye. "Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared," he said. "It means you do the right thing even when you are." Carter nodded, and Shaq ruffled his hair gently before standing. As he drove away, the town falling behind him in the rearview mirror, Shaq knew the battle wasn't over. The fire started by Madeline's lies wouldn't die out overnight. His reputation would still bear the scars. There would still be whispers, still be glances filled with suspicion and resentment. But something had shifted. The river had stirred. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't undo what had been seen, what had been said. In Willow Creek, built on the ashes of old sins and buried truths, a spark had caught. And fire, once born, is hard to contain. The river had stirred the town's conscience, but conscience alone wasn't enough. Willow Creek was a place built on layered silences, on histories packed down like earth, atop forgotten graves. It would take more than a child's courage, or a hero's patience to unearth it all. It would take proof, solid, undeniable, the kind that couldn't be laughed off or quietly buried again. The old man found it. Shaq hadn't seen him since the night outside the youth center construction site, when the photograph had passed between them like a key to a locked door. But the man had promised there was more, and true to his word, he returned when the town was at its most frayed, when the tension hummed loud enough to make the air itself buzz. Shaq was sitting on the steps of the gym, watching the evening mist creep in from the river, when the old man approached again. His limp was worse now. His shoulders hunched as if the weight of what he carried bent him further each day. In his hand was a battered leather satchel, bulging with papers that looked as tired as he did. He didn't say anything as he sat beside Shaq with a groan, laying the bag carefully between them. Shaq glanced at him, saw the set of his jaw, the firm decision carved into his worn features.
"You ready?" the old man asked finally, voice scraping across the dusk.
Shaq nodded. The man opened the satchel, pulling out yellowed documents, photographs, handwritten ledgers. Piece by piece, he laid out a history that Willow Creek had spent decades pretending didn't exist. Deeds illegally transferred, contracts with forged signatures, arrest records doctored to criminalize black landowners and clear the way for white speculators. Testimonies from elderly residents long ignored, their words now pressed into affidavits that spoke louder than any living voice. And threading through it all was one name: Cross. Madeline's family hadn't just profited from the town's old sins, they had orchestrated them, built an empire on stolen lives and stolen futures. They had laundered that history into respectability, passing down wealth scrubbed clean of the blood that paid for it. Shaq sifted through the papers slowly, methodically, his stomach knotting tighter with every new revelation. This wasn't just about him. This was about an entire town's soul, held hostage by a legacy no one wanted to claim, but many still protected. "They buried it deep," the old man said, coughing into his fist. "But stones don't stay silent forever. Not when someone's willing to listen." Shaq gathered the documents, folding them back into the satchel. The decision was already made. There would be no more quiet appeals, no more playing by rules rigged from the beginning. He planned the confrontation carefully. There would be no shouting, no spectacle. That would only feed the fear already simmering in town. No, Shaq's plan was simpler, and infinitely more dangerous. He would hold a community meeting. He would present the evidence without accusation. Without rage, he would let the stones speak for themselves. He knew it would fracture the town. He knew it might destroy any future he had hoped to build here. But truth demanded a price. It always had. As word of the upcoming meeting spread, so did the fear. Small signs of panic flickered through Willow Creek like brush fires. The mayor's office issued a sudden community reassurance statement. Heavy on platitudes but suspiciously light on specifics. The local radio station aired call-ins about respecting our history and not letting outside forces sow division. Flyers appeared overnight, urging residents to stand together against falsehoods. Madeline Cross went silent. She disappeared from public view, retreating into the high fences of her ancestral home, like a queen under siege. But her allies worked overtime, whispering poison into every willing ear. Shaq felt the pressure build every day. At the grocery store, cashiers served him last, no matter how short his line. At the gas station, his tires were slashed one night, while he met with Elijah Boone to plan logistics for the meeting. Anonymous notes found their way under his windshield wipers, tucked into his mail. "You'll regret this. Know your place. Some ghosts don't stay buried." Each act was meant to intimidate, to wear him down, to convince him that silence was safer. Each act only sharpened his resolve. The night before the meeting, Shaq sat alone in the gym, the satchel beside him, the sound of the river threading through the broken windows. He reviewed every document, every photo, every painful shard of evidence. He felt the weight of the town's anger gathering against him like a storm just beyond the horizon. He thought of walking away. He thought of how easy it would be to leave the satchel behind, to drive out of Willow Creek and never look back. But he also thought of Carter Reeves, standing alone against a tide of adult cowardice. He thought of Elijah Boone, risking the only community he had ever known to stand with him. He thought of the nameless men and women whose lives had been ground underfoot, so Madeline Cross's family could sip sweet tea on shaded porches and pretend at gentility. The stones had waited long enough. Shaq didn't sleep that night. He didn't need to. Some fights, you enter already, knowing you won't walk away clean. The next morning, the town square was packed again. Word had spread far beyond the usual circles. Everyone came, some curious, some furious, some afraid. Shaq stood alone at the front of the crowd, the satchel at his feet. No podium, no stage, just the open air and the heavy weight of a truth too long suppressed. He said nothing at first. Instead, he knelt and opened the satchel, pulling out the first document, a deed, signed and witnessed, showing the illegal seizure of black-owned land by Madeline's grandfather. He held it high for everyone to see. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Faces blanched, heads craned to read the details. Shaq didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He simply let the truth breathe. One by one, he laid the evidence out across the steps of the courthouse. The fraudulent contracts, the doctored arrest reports, the ledgers showing profits funneled from stolen labor into cross-family coffers. With every piece he revealed, the murmuring grew louder, more panicked. Sheriff Dalton tried to step forward, mouth opening to interrupt, but he faltered under the weight of the crowd's sudden attention. The mayor stood frozen, sweat beading at his temple. And somewhere in the back, Madeline Cross appeared, pale, trembling, her hands clenched into fists so tight the knuckles gleamed bone white. Shaq finally spoke, his voice calm and clear. "This isn't about the past," he said. "This is about what we choose to be now. About whether we let lies keep us chained, or whether we face them and move forward." The town stood at a crossroads, trembling. Some faces turned away, unable or unwilling to confront the truth laid bare at their feet. But others, Clarissa Dean, Elijah Boone, Carter Reeves, stood straighter, their eyes fierce with something new, recognition, and a painful kind of hope. Shaq didn't expect applause. He didn't expect immediate change. He knew wounds like these festered long before they ever bled in public. But the stones had spoken, and the ground beneath Willow Creek would never feel as steady again. As he gathered the papers, feeling the first cool gusts of autumn stirring around him, Shaq knew this was only the beginning. There would be retaliation. There would be anger. But there would also be cracks in the wall that had held back justice for too long. Cracks that would widen with every voice that refused to be silenced. Cracks that would, in time, bring the whole rotten edifice crashing down. The river had tried to swallow the truth. But truth, once unearthed, doesn't drown. It rises. And it speaks, even through stone. Then, from the edge of the gathering, a small, clear voice rang out. "I have something to show." Heads turned sharply. Carter stepped forward, clutching something to his chest. His father tried to grab him, whispering harshly, but Carter shook free, his face pale but burning with a fierce determination that made Shaq's throat tighten. In his hands was a battered tablet, cracked, scuffed, but glowing faintly. Shaq frowned slightly, confused, until Carter turned it toward the crowd and pressed play. The video flickered to life. At first the image was shaky, the sound muffled, but soon enough the picture sharpened, and there it was. Madeline Cross, striding up to the stage at the Riverside event. Madeline Cross, yanking the phone from Shaq's hands. Madeline Cross, hurling it into the river with a vicious snap of her wrist. Gasps exploded through the crowd. Louder, sharper, uncontrollable. There was no room for interpretation, no room for spin. The act was naked in its hate, its premeditation, and the murmured words caught on the recording, spat through clenched teeth, sealed it beyond doubt. Don't belong here. Carter flinched as the crowd reacted, but Shaq stepped forward, placing one massive hand gently on the boy's shoulder, grounding him. Madeline herself, who had hovered near the fringes of the gathering, stumbled backward, as if the video had struck her a physical blow. Her face twisted, first with shock, then with a desperate rage, that curdled visibly before she turned and fled through the crowd, parting them like a phantom of her former authority. The silence that followed was different from before. Heavier. Final. Shaq bent down, taking the tablet carefully from Carter's trembling hands, and faced the crowd once more. You all saw it, he said. Not a story, not a rumor, not a whisper passed in secret. The truth. He handed the tablet to Sheriff Dalton, who accepted it with shaking hands, the weight of responsibility finally undeniable. Shaq could have stopped there, but he didn't, because moments like this demanded more than proof. They demanded heart. He turned back to the people of Willow Creek, his voice deepening, carrying with it all the years he had lived carrying burdens unseen and unspoken. This isn't just about her, he said. It's about every choice we make from here on. About whether we let the stones stay silent, or whether we start building something better. He stepped back then, giving the town the space to decide for itself. The crowd stood frozen for a heartbeat. Then Elijah Boone stepped forward, his hand raised in a small, solemn gesture of solidarity. Clarissa followed, her jaw tight but her eyes bright. One by one, others moved too. Not all, not even most, but enough to know that the spell of silence had been broken. Enough to know that tomorrow would not be a simple echo of yesterday. Carter clung to Shaq's side, and Shaq let him. The boy had risked everything to speak. So had Shaq. And in doing so, they had both risen higher than anyone had expected. In the days that followed, the town struggled. There were angry voices, broken friendships, painful reckonings. Businesses closed their doors early. Families packed and left. The river ran thick with unease. But there was also something else, something newer, rawer, a sense of possibility threading itself into the town's foundation. The youth center project, long stalled, was quietly greenlit by a newly restructured council. Donations trickled in, small but sincere. Volunteers showed up in worn boots and work gloves, heads bowed but hands steady. And through it all, Shaq remained, not as a conqueror, not as a martyr, but as a man who had refused to fall. A man who had risen not because he was stronger, not because he was louder, but because he had believed, even when believing meant standing alone. The river no longer seemed indifferent to Shaq. Now when he walked its banks, it whispered something different. Not erasure, not threat, recognition. The stones had spoken, the river had witnessed. And Big Shaq, against every expectation, had risen.
Not above the town.
With it, or at least what it could still become. The chains that bound Willow Creek were not made of iron or steel. They were older, quieter, harder to see, built from years of silence, of swallowed truths, of whispered warnings passed from parent to child like heirlooms. No one wanted but no one dared throw away. And like all chains, they carried the illusion of permanence, until the day someone dared to pull. Shaq didn't need to pull hard. He simply stood long enough, quietly enough, honestly enough, and the chains began to creak under their own weight. After Carter's video played, after the town square scattered like startled birds, the crumbling of Madeline Cross's lies happened with brutal swiftness. She tried to issue a statement through her lawyer, blaming stress, misunderstanding, heightened emotions at the charity event, but no one was buying what she was selling anymore. The images were too clear, the truth too vivid. The town newspapers, once reluctant to even whisper dissent, now published front-page editorials calling for accountability. The sheriff, pressured by a growing chorus of voices, opened an official inquiry into Madeline's actions and the town's mishandling of past complaints. The mayor, sensing which way the wind was blowing, announced his early resignation, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. The Cross family name, once synonymous with power, curdled in the mouths of the people like spoiled milk. Businesses that had proudly displayed old photographs of deals made with Madeline's ancestors quietly took them down. Streets named after her grandfather became the subject of petitions and heated debate. Madeline herself, stripped of influence and allies, retreated behind the gates of her decaying mansion, a prisoner of her own making. And yet, even as the truth rose like a flood, the healing was not simple. Shaq walked the town's streets in the days that followed, and saw the scars the old lies had left behind. Saw them in the wary glances exchanged between neighbors who now realized they had been complicit in a silence too heavy to lift easily. Saw them in the children who looked at the adults with a new questioning suspicion. Saw them in the church pews left half empty, in the meetings where voices cracked and hands trembled, admitting what had been so long denied. Racism, like rust, had eaten deep into the bones of Willow Creek, and one storm, no matter how righteous, couldn't wash it all away at once. Shaq understood that. He didn't expect applause, didn't expect gratitude. He hadn't stayed to be a hero. He had stayed because leaving unfinished battles behind had never been his way. But now, standing at the river's edge once again, watching the muddy water tumble past in endless conversation with the stones, he knew his time here was ending. He had done what he came to do, not perfectly, not without scars, but honestly. The river no longer seemed like an enemy. It no longer whispered of swallowed truths and drowned dreams. Now it carried something different, cleansing, painful, inevitable. The river was no longer a grave. It was a beginning. Shaq knelt by the riverbank, scooping up a handful of cold water and letting it run between his fingers. He thought of the phone lost to its depths, the history buried in its currents. He thought of the promises made, broken, mended again. The chains had cracked. They would never be as strong as they once were. Behind him, voices carried from the newly reopened youth center, the building he had fought so hard for. Children's laughter floated across the fields, thin but growing stronger each day. Parents lined up with folding chairs and lemonade stands, volunteering hours they once guarded jealously. Not everyone participated. Some would never change, but enough had. Enough to make the fight worth it. Shaq stood, brushing the dirt from his jeans. He didn't need to say goodbye. Goodbyes belonged to finished stories, and Willow Creek's story was just beginning. He made his way through town one last time, not drawing attention to himself, not making speeches. He stopped by the mechanic shop, where Elijah Boone handed him a battered old baseball cap, with a crooked smile and a firm handshake. He stopped by the library, where Clarissa Dean tucked a book into his hand without a word. A People's History of the United States. Its spine cracked, its margins full of her own furious, hopeful notes. He paused at Carter Reeves's house, tapping lightly on the screen door. The boy came running, eyes wide, a grin splitting his face. "You're leaving?" Carter asked, the words small, heavy with the knowledge that nothing lasts forever. Shaq knelt to his level. "Not leaving," he said, "just making room for you to leave." Carter swallowed hard but nodded, his skinny shoulders straightening with a resolve Shaq recognized all too well. Shaq ruffled his hair gently before standing, tipping his cap once before heading down the street. By the time the sun dipped low, burning the sky in oranges and deep reds, Shaq's truck rolled out of Willow Creek, dust trailing behind it like a memory already starting to fade. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care, but because he trusted that the river, once a symbol of secrets and shame, would keep flowing forward, not backward. Trusted that the stones he had uncovered would not be buried again, so easily. Trusted that somewhere in the heart of a small, battered town, the broken chains would be left where they belonged, in pieces at the river's edge. The healing would be slow. It would be ugly, painful, uncertain, but healing would come, not with force, with faith. And sometimes, faith is enough. As he merged onto the open highway, the town growing smaller in the rearview mirror, Shaq smiled for the first time in days. Not a forced, public smile. Not the kind worn like armor. A real smile. A free one. Because no matter how hard Willow Creek had tried, It hadn't broken him. And maybe, just maybe, it had started to fix itself. The youth center Shaq had fought so hard for didn't just survive. It flourished. What started as a modest basketball court and a few classrooms grew into a full campus over the next 2 years, complete with a library wing, a recording studio, and a garden maintained by the kids themselves. Carter Reeves, once the small, trembling boy who stood up when it mattered most, became the youth center's unofficial ambassador. His voice steady, his back unbowed. More families started attending town meetings, questioning decisions, pushing for policies that reflected all of Willow Creek, not just the loudest parts. It wasn't easy. Old habits fought hard not to die. There were setbacks, ugly debates, and nights when it seemed like the town might splinter beyond repair. But it didn't, because sometimes change doesn't come like a thunderclap. Sometimes it creeps in like roots under a foundation, slow but inevitable, lifting the ground until the old walls crack and fall away. And yet through it all, Shaq's name was spoken sparingly, not because he had been forgotten, because he had become something bigger than a man. He had become a reminder. That truth costs. That standing costs. That hope costs. But sometimes the cost is worth it. What no one expected, what not even Shaq himself expected, was the letter. It arrived one ordinary afternoon nearly a year after he left Willow Creek, delivered to a post office box he maintained under a different name for privacy. The envelope was plain, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded crisply, the handwriting spidery and elegant in black ink. It read, "I do not deserve forgiveness. I know that. But I wanted you to know. I see it now. What I tried to protect was never pride. It was fear. And fear rots everything it touches. I do not expect you to understand. I do not expect you to answer. But thank you. Not just for standing against me, but for showing me the chains I had wrapped around myself long before I tried to wrap them around you. A fool who finally listened." There was no signature, no name, but Shaq knew who had written it. Madeline Croft. He read the letter once, then again, then a third time. And when he was finished, he folded it carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. He didn't write back. He didn't tell anyone. Some forgiveness, he had learned, doesn't need words. Some forgiveness isn't a conversation. It's a choice made quietly, stubbornly, without expectation of acknowledgement or reward. Shaq carried the letter with him after that, tucked into the worn leather journal he kept by his bedside, not as a trophy, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that even the hardest hearts can crack, that even the deepest chains can break, that even rivers, long burdened with silence, can learn new songs. Life moved on, as life always does. Shaq returned to his work, mentoring, building, speaking where his voice could build bridges instead of walls. He didn't chase fame. He didn't seek out headlines. He moved the way rivers do, steady, unstoppable, reshaping the world one stone at a time. And sometimes on quiet nights, when the weight of the world pressed against his chest like a familiar old ache, he would pull out that letter and read it again. Not for her sake, for his, because victories aren't always parades and medals. Sometimes the greatest battles are won without throwing a single punch. Sometimes they're won by standing when you're told to kneel, by speaking when you're told to be silent, by walking away when pride demands you stay and fight, and by believing fiercely, stubbornly, without proof that truth matters, that people can change, that rivers can be redeemed. Shaq never returned to Willow Creek. He didn't need to, because the best victories aren't about being seen. They're about seeing what no one else dared to hope for, and refusing to let that hope die. Every story leaves a mark, but the real journey begins when you dare to carry it forward. Stand where others fall. Listen where others stay silent. Because the fight for truth isn't over. It's just waiting for the next soul brave enough to rise. Stay with us. The next chapter is already calling.